that there can be more, how can I put it? There can be more in-depth and more rigorous introductions to electronic literature, but for logistical reasons and for reasons related to time, I have decided to keep my presentation rather short so that we can have more discussions, and that you faculty members yourself can take off and do your own learning, so as to speak. So without further ado, first things first is I would like to give a sort of brief overview as to how I have planned out the session. Uh, so the first thing which I will do is I'll explain how did I come across electronic literature, and what kind of work that I have done with electronic literature and how have I done it. And then I will move on to the first set of discussions about electronic literature. And as you can see that I have a lot of academic kind of papers that I want to discuss with you, certain concepts that I want to talk to you about. Before we move on to actually looking at some electronic literature pieces, so certain texts, and to see that how we can talk about them, how we can read them rather. Then the discussion will move forward to talking about the research that has happened in India, because I believe that contextualization is extremely important. Then I will talk about the variants, the different types of electronic literature that can be there. But of course, once again, this is not a definitive list, and this is very much suited to the needs of teaching electronic literature in an Indian classroom. That's how I have visualized my presentation. But for the context of giving you more exposure per se as an individual, I will of course just Google certain things up and I will show you how things may or may not operate. In this regard, I will also show you what is not electronic literature, or how people look at electronic literature in terms of collaboration. Now, this data is from my MA thesis survey, which has very recently been published. So I will talk about this data as well, and what does this data mean in terms of platforms and print aesthetics and gender and intentionality. And then I will talk about the problems of teaching of electronic literature in the classroom, and how databases and collections become very important in this case. And then finally, I will be looking at certain events that have happened recently. I mean, there have been other events that have happened in and around electronic literature, but these are the few events that I will be talking about, because there are only so much we can talk about, right? And then finally, I will be talking about certain disciplinary intersections, that electronic literature can, many people call it to be a subset of digital humanities, and people say the same thing about video game studies, and digital humanities has its own relations with critical infrastructure studies, science and technology studies, and so on and so forth. So we will be exploring these few dimensions as much as we can in the course of this discussion. So thus far, is there any question that you would like me to address before we start seriously diving deep into the material, as it were?
No, sir. Please
No, sir.
continue.
All right, thank you so much. So the first things first is to point out that how did I stumble here? The reason why I am not doing it in full screen is simply because I will be jumping in and around between browser windows and the screen, so there is no point in putting it up in full screen, the slides. So first things first is how did I stumble here? Now, my interest in electronic literature, the reason why I'm talking about my interest in electronic literature is because it is very important to note that because electronic literature, digital literature, whatever you want to call it, it exists. I mean, hegemonically, it has been understood to exist only in the digital space. I mean, why I'm saying that, that is something that can we challenge, that is something that we will talk about later on as well. Because it primarily exists in the digital space, and if we look at, let's say, a pre-COVID India, or a pre geo internet India, the internet was fairly much more expensive in, let's say, 2014 15, before the advent of geo, which I believe started out in 2016, if I am not wrong. Because of that, and also the fact that when I was growing up, for that matter, I distinctly remember that most people did not have a personal computer at their homes. So assuming that people had or have had access to the digital for a long time is an elitist assumption. And therefore, it is very important to consider that while the digital may seem to be within everybody's reach, it is not very easy to make that deduction. That the idea of digital divide is something that is central to my understanding of electronic literature scholarship, and I will build on it further even more as we go forward. So I have had always a lot of interest in writing and also in computer. So in school, my two favorite subjects were English and computer. That's how I came into doing digital humanities, and that's how most people come to doing digital humanities, to merge the best of both worlds, so as to speak. So I opened this kind of blog called the Penarchist, which of course is a name that I gave, and that was a kind of starting point for me into creating electronic literature. I will talk about that more later on. Into creating electronic literature, but I did not realize about the academic space inhabited by electronic literature, because I was not aware of the discourse that was going on. In and around late December 2019, mid December 2019, IIT Gandhinagar did a winter school on digital humanities, Winter Institute in Digital Humanities, right? There, I got to know about certain basics relating to digital humanities. And I distinctly remember that it was at that particular point in time, when I was just about to start my second semester of my master's, that I started to understand the academic implications of electronic literature. And then I thought to myself that, hang on, I have been doing a primitive version of this from my bedroom, when I was in since when I was in school. So that is the foundation point into where my introduction to electronic literature lies. Why I'm saying this is because when I will discuss the research and when I will discuss certain epistemic questions relating to electronic literature, these origin stories will come in handy as to understand, why cannot there be an attempt at a unified historiography of the field that does not apply to electronic literature singularly, that applies to every field in existence out there. And very recently, I mean, at the middle point of 2021, when I was finishing my master's and about to start my PhD, I also created an entry about Indian electronic literature in the electronic literature knowledge base, which is also called ELMCIP, ELMCIP. I will be talking about ELMCIP later on, of course, when I talk about databases and archives and what role they play in electronic literature. So yeah, so this I created an entry. It's a metadata managed site where I tried to curate an entry on Indian electronic literature. But of course, you have to understand that that's very limited, and it has its limitations. It has its huge limitations, right? So that is what I want to bring out, is that these tensions within the discipline, its politics, and its certain facets, so that it empowers you to conduct your own research. Of course, that is the goal here. Now, another very important part of electronic literature or any emerging field in the global south is community formation, creating communities, creating spaces. And this is something that I'm very vocal about. This is the kind of activism, academic activism, that you may want to call it. So I happen to be the founder of this body called Electronic Literature India. I mean, it's not a registered body or anything. We are in the process of getting registration, but that is a long haul. of course. So this is as of yet this exists as a Twitter page and a WhatsApp group. And if anybody of you is interested in joining the WhatsApp group, feel free to get in touch with me. No problem, I'll just add you. No worries. Uh, but however, this group does not exist in a silo. It exists in communication. It exists in dialogue with two other bodies, one in digital humanities and the other on game studies, that many of you may be aware of. The first is in digital humanities, called Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations. And it is very important to note that I myself got introduced to Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations immediately when the winter school in digital humanities at IIT Gandhinagar was going on. So scholarship and communities, and being a part of the communities and having access to scholarship, they're fundamentally connected to each other. And this point about networking is something that I want to drive home very, very truly, because when I first joined 30, when I first was getting attuned to DH, I remember that for months and months, I did not read a single paper about digital humanities. I had no clue about digital humanities when I was starting out. And I was constantly thinking to myself that, do I even belong here? Is this something that I can do? But I was a part of the group. I was a participant in a particular group, a particular community, and I was learning by being a part of the group, by engaging in the
Okay, sir.
conversations.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Sir, can you make it in slideshow so that we can see the slides?
Okay.
Thank you.
I mentioned that I mentioned that the reason that I did not put on the slideshow is because I will be jumping in and out of the slides a lot. But okay, fine. I understand that it might be important. Uh, so yeah, I was learning by association, and that is why having these spaces of dialogue, especially for people, young students who aren't who are yet to start their PhDs, these support systems and networks, they become extremely important in facilitating scholarship. Number one, Dharti. Currently serve in the executive committee of Dharti. So if you have any questions, or if you want to join Dharti or Digra for that matter, please let me know. And then comes Digra India, which is the Digital Games Research Association's India chapter. It was previously called Game Studies India, and I have been there since the start of this body. It's a body which has been founded by people like Shouvik Mukherjee, Poonam Chaudhary, Zahra Rizvi, and so on and so forth. And I remember that when I was thinking to start Electronic Literature India, these two bodies came very handy for me, and the support that these networks gave me were indispensable, because I was doing my master's thesis at that point of time, and I was collecting data for my master's thesis. And when I was taking the survey respondents, when I was taking the survey results from the respondents via a Google form, I asked them that, do you want to join a community like Electronic Literature India? And I led them on to another Google form page. And that's how the WhatsApp group came into being, because that was the most preferred mode of interaction for the people who signed up for it. Now, as you may understand, that there is a COVID virus image here. Why? Because as you may understand, that all of these things, the formation of Electronic Literature India, me publishing my master's thesis data, and then getting it published later on, all of these happened in the peak of my second wave. If you speak about me personally, it is also written in my published paper that I will show you right now, is that the study was conducted at the height of the second wave of the raging pandemic in India. My own mother was sick in the very next room where I am sitting right now, where I was working at that point of time as well. So I feel that as academics, it is very important for us to just not to do scholarship, but also be sensitively aware of when to not do scholarship. And I feel that my association with these spaces, which led to me creating another space, has led to this heightened sensitive awareness of what to do, what not to do, and how to do it. Moving on. about the discussions. The reason why I spent so much time talking about community politics, community building, is because that I find it very important that a field which is still as small as electronic literature, it demands to expand its community. Very recently, Jamia Millia Islamia did its conference, a dedicated conference on electronic literature, and I was very proud to be one of the co-organizers of that conference. And there, Dr. Siddhartha Chakraborty from Aligarh Muslim University mentioned that it is very important that we bring the band back together. That is a very important comment that he made, that the experts, the people, it's very important that we get them together so as to get the resources out there, promote more access. But it's also more important that we bring the band together to disband the band once again, because it is important that we also not have the same people doing the same things over and over and over again. It is very important to have more people, more voices, more diverse voices into the picture. Otherwise, a field can never grow. All right. With that kind of an introduction, I will move on to talking about a certain theoretical aspects, the theoretical underpinnings, if you will, for electronic literature. So, can you see cybertext perspectives on ergodic literature by Espen Orsef? Can you see this?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see.
All right. Okay, fine. So, as you may understand, this work by Espen. If you just Google it real quick, it is one of the foundational texts for video game studies. But I find it absolutely important for electronic literature as well, because of something called traversal mechanics or the ergodics of it. Right. So that is something that I want to discuss briefly here before moving into other works, other pieces. Right? Can the moderator please tell me how much time I have?
Sir, another half an hour.
Okay, fine. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So, with that introduction, I would like to delve deep into it. What is ergodic literature? So, the concept of cybertext, I am highlighting certain parts and I am zooming them in so that it is easier for you to see. Likewise, the concept of cybertext does not limit itself to the study of computer driven or electronic textuality. That would be an arbitrary and unhistorical limitation. Perhaps comparable to a study of literature that would only acknowledge texts in paper printed form. While there might be sociological reasons for such a study, we would not be able to claim any understanding of how forms of literature vary. Now, this is like a context. Now, the concept of cybertext, this is where it starts. The concept of cybertext focuses on the mechanical organization of the text by positing the intricacies of the medium as an integral part of the literary exchange. So, the politics of the medium, that it is not what you are reading, but where you are reading. The materiality is very important. However, it also centers attention on the consumer or user of the text as a more integrated figure than even reader response theorists would claim. The performance of the reader takes place all in the head, while the user of the cybertext also performs in an extra nomadic sense. Now, let me boil this down. What does an extra nomadic sense mean? Now, why does he say that even reader response theorists, whatever they would claim that even a cybertext, the reader, so called reader, does more than that? That is because when you are reading a print text, let's say, what are you doing when you are reading a print text? You are moving your eyeballs from left to right. Or if you're reading Urdu, you are doing it the opposite way. If you're reading and then you are turning the pages, you're moving from page to page, you are turning your eyeballs. That is the physical work that you are doing, right? However, let's say when you're browsing a web page, what you are doing? You are maybe typing something, you are searching for something, you are moving around your cursor, your pointer, you are clicking on certain things, you are moving your eyes around. It's not linear. Think about how you use a dictionary. You There is no linearity. You may be turning on the pages like this, but you are still moving your eyeballs around, but you are not interacting with the text like you are doing when you are using a web page. You are physically more engaged while navigating the text. So that is what he calls extra nomadic or non trivial effort. What is the trivial effort? Here he talks about it. In ergodic literature, non trivial effort is required to allow the reader to traverse the text. That is what he calls ergodic, which means it comes from ergon and hodos, which means work and path. So you have to work your way along a path to get meaning. Here, during the cybertextual process, the user will have effectuated a semiotic sequence, and this selective movement is a work of physical construction that the various concepts of reading, and by reading in the print form, do not account for. So that is what we are focusing on here, right? If ergodic literature is to make sense as a concept, there also must be non-ergodic literature, where the effort to traverse the text is trivial, with no extra nomadic responsibilities placed on the reader except for eye movement and the periodic or arbitrary turning of pages. So, in order for something to be called ergodic, according to Espen, there has to be more movement, more effort than these. Unfortunately, because of paucity of time, I cannot go more into this. This is just the basics of it so that you understand these terms like cybertext, ergodic text, uh, traversal, extra nomadic responsibility, non-trivial effort, and so on. I think these terms will be handy when we move on. Okay, so next comes N. Catherine Hales, who happens to, you can call it the founding mother of the field of electronic literature. I don't want to use a gender term, but for the sake of convenience, here we are. Okay, so this book came out in 1999. It's called Electronic Literature, New Horizons for the Literary. And the thing that I will be talking about is this one. Electronic literature, what is it? This part. This is the book. I wanted to show the book because you may be interested in navigating the book, and it is available in open access. But this paper was revised in the form of a website entry with the first chapter, as you can see it here, electronic literature, what is it? That is chapter 1. It was refashioned into this website entry here, the Electronic Literature Organization's website. Now, the Electronic Literature Organization, as you may understand, is the worldwide body. It is still very, I mean, American, European, global North, whatever you want to call about. But it is the biggest body when it comes to electronic literature. I mean, there are other bodies about digital, interactive narrative, and so on and so forth. But if you talk about electronic literature per se, it is the body. Now, what does terminologies mean? What do they signify? These are certain critical terms that I will hint at towards the end. Now, let's look at certain issues here. A context for electronic literature. Now, this part is very important. Now, these are some of the, as you may understand, now hallowed pieces in the study of electronic literature. Electronic literature generally considered to exclude print literature that has been digitized and is by contrast digital born. So Hales is making the argument that digitized print texts cannot be electronic literature. Now, I am one of those scholars who contest this idea, and I have been trying for a very long time now. And it has to be digital born, it has to be created in the digital space. A first generation digital object created on a computer and usually meant to be read on a computer. Now, as you may understand, it's written in 2007 and it places a centrality on the computer because the smartphone as a gadget is still yet to become the norm. So there are many instances of scholarships that have happened later on that destabilizes the idea of the centrality of the computer in the idea of electronic literature. Now, the Electronic Literature Organization, whose mission is to promote, now the Electronic Literature Organization annual conference is starting in fairly 10 days now. It's happening in Coimbra in Portugal. I'm very excited to be there. Whose mission is to promote the writing, publishing, and reading of literature in electronic media. Now, this idea came into being, this definition, so as to speak, this came into being more prominently in and around 2004, when a committee that was headed by this person, a very prominent scholar, Noah Wardrip-Wynne, who headed this committee and came up with this idea. Now, what are the genres of electronic literature? There is another scholar who I will be referring to a bit later, Scott Retberg. Now, Scott does a better, more, I would say, because the way he structures his book, and of course you have to note that Scott's works comes way after Catherine Hills's work. But if you want to get an understanding of the different styles of genre and whether at all we can ask the question of genre in electronic literature, is something that Scott handles very well. So I will not talk about genre and all that contestations as of yet, but I will be talking about something else, which is called this one. That what are these generations? In my this is what Catherine Hill says. In my keynote speech at 2002 Electronic Literature Symposium at UCLA, these distinctions, the distinctions about electronic literature, access, and which pieces of electronic literature has what extent of interactivity, that led her to call the first generation of electronic literature works as first generation electronic literature. Now, what are these first generation electronic literatures? This is where she talks about it. Whereas early works tended to be blocks of texts, traditionally called lexia, with limited graphics, animations, colors, and sounds. Now, that is what she calls the first generation of electronic literature. That the early internet only had limited capabilities, right? And therefore, the experimentation that one could do about that hypertextual questions were limited. And later on, those were called first generation electronic literature. But later on, when we had, let's say, much greater network capabilities of writing, of working, etc., these ideas become dominant, and that is what is called as second generation electronic literature, which uses the capability of the internet, of the web, of the media to a much, much greater degree. There has also been one paper by Leonardo Flores, who happens to be my supervisor, co-supervisor, which is, the paper is a seminal paper called Third Generation Electronic Literature, and I will be talking about that as well. So these are like the basic concept building blocks about electronic literature. The first, second, third generation as of yet. Now, you may have heard of this term, interactive fiction, as well. Now, she also addresses this question that IF differs from electronic literature in having stronger game-like elements. Now, if you want to read up about electronic literature and gaming, I would also like you to read the work of Professor Dr. Astrid Enslin. And once again, if you need access to any of these resources, please let me know. I would be more than happy to redirect you to them. I am going over these in brief, and I can totally understand that if these may seem a little overwhelming. Now, moving on, Scott's work in 2009, this is called Communitizing Electronic Literature. Now, this paper by Scott talks about what I started my talk with, the importance of building a community, communitizing electronic literature. I could have easily talked about this without referring to the scholarship, without referring to the papers, but I am doing so consciously, keeping in mind that it is important to know about the scholarship, not only to conduct research, but also to teach in class. So, the field of literature, electronic literature is based on a gift economy and developed network based literary culture built on collaborative practices of a globally distributed communities of artists, writers, and scholars. The article situates the development of the field of electronic literature within the academy, some of the institutional challenges currently confronting the field, and its potential for further development. So, this paper, it's a big paper. Of course, I cannot talk about it a lot, but it talks about electronic literature organization, why we need to have a community in such an emergent field. Now, as it holds true in the year 2009 when this paper was published, it still holds true right now. Because as you may understand, that these configurations, be it Catherine Hills, be it Espen, be it Scott, whoever you talk about, they are talking about electronic literature from their position as scholars placed in America or Europe. But what about the global south? What about Africa? What about the Middle East? What about India? These are questions that I will come to after I have talked a little bit in establishing the basic building blocks of the field. Moving on, Serge and David wrote this paper. Serge Bouchardon and David Heckman talk about digital manipulability and digital literature, where they say how. Now, Catherine Hales has also another seminal paper called this one. This is not directly related to electronic literature, but this is very important and I had to show that. Print is flat, but code is deep. Now, this is one of the most important paragraphs of this entire paper, is that lulled into somnolence by 500 years of print, literary analysis should awaken to the importance of media-specific analysis, a mode of critical attention which recognizes that all texts are instantiated and the nature of the medium in which they're instantiated matters. So when we're going back to Espen, we're going back to Catherine Hales' earlier one that I talked about, that it is not just what you read, but where and how you read it. And this is something that she talks about. She talks about something called the flickering signifier. So in this paper in 1999, I am just mentioning it to you here, she talks about virtual bodies and flickering signifiers. Now, why is the idea of flickering signifiers so important? It is because when, let's say, when we are looking at an Amazon website, you see that when you open the website, there is a Samsung mobile phone ad. But when you go back to it, there is a washing machine ad in that place. So what happened to that one? Did it disappear? Did it go away? Now, if you look at the web space, if you look at the digital space, you will see that signifiers are constantly coming in and out and in and out of existence. Now, this idea is what is called a flickering signifier. Now, Bouchardon and Heckman in this paper build on the idea of flickering signifiers and talk about a little bit more in terms of rhetoric and semiosis, etc., etc. Pushado and Heckman showed that digital literature employs a rhetoric of grasping, where you constantly are trying to catch meaning, but meaning is moving away from you. I know that this sounds very Derrida-esque, but remember, Derrida is mostly talking about print text. Yes, in Archive Fever, at towards the end of Archive Fever, he is also talking about writing in a computer, but he does not delve into more detail regarding that. That is why we need dedicated scholarship regarding it as well. Right. Moving ahead. Now, this is the book that I was talking about, Electronic Literature by Scott Redberg. Very important to understand the generic divisions as we speak. Okay. So, this is the book. This is the book, Electronic Literature by Scott Redberg. Now, the reason that I'm showing this book is because I believe this book is accessible. If it is not, please let me know. I will try my best to make it available to you. Now, I will just go back to the electronic literature entry on Wikipedia and just give you a little bit of a lowdown about these elements, because these are what form some of the genre classifications: cybertext, digital poetry, generative art, hypermedia, interactive fiction, and so on and so forth. So these are various types of it. There can also be insta poetry. There can also be net prov, which is internet based improvisation, cell phone novels, Twitter novels, and also Twitter bots that can be created to generate things. Now, let's boil these down a little bit. I will talk a little bit more about it when I progress in my talk. But of course, for now, this is something that I wanted to give an introduction on. And finally, we reach the idea of third generation literature. Now remember, first and second generation of literature is where Catherine Hales was talking about pre-web or early web and later web, where we did not have a lot of media capability and we did have a lot of media capability. What Leo is doing, Professor Dr. Leonardo Flores is doing here, is he is talking about the element of virality. That memes, come on, memes, YouTube videos, this, that, things which go viral, are they electronic literature? He says yes, because of that element of virality. And he is building on from Scott and Catherine. Many of the electronic literature genres that emerged in the first and second generations continue in the third, such as bots, that is Twitter bots, electronic poetry, video poetry, hypertext fiction, mobile and locative works. Locative works is work that are based on location, virtual reality, augmented reality, and are revitalized as they find new forms in third generation with Twine games. Now, Twine is a dedicated platform in itself which has that potential of interaction. And I can show about it later on. I am just going over it bits and pieces because we don't have a lot of time. Twitter bots, Instagram poetry, GIFs, and memes. So he brings all of these into the picture and he calls them third generation electronic literature. Now, because I am privy to Leo's work, I can say that now he is trying to destabilize the entire generational model. That is something that both of us are trying to do together. That is what I did in my recent paper with Astrid Enslin as well. Is that what is the generational model? Does the generational model not prioritize a hierarchy of computational access in one geography over another? I mean, what Americans call first generation electronic literature can be current electronic literature to me 10 years ago. So is the generational model of historicizing a field, pardon me, a good model of a field? Now, these are advanced questions, right? Now, I'll just quickly mention these three texts. Bookishness by Jessica Pressman looks at book aesthetics and how the aesthetic of the book has percolated in the digital. It is not electronic literature per se, but it's a favorite work of mine. I love Jessica's work, so please check it out. And this one, Electronic Literature as Digital Humanities, is a book collection that came out from Bloomsbury. And this talks about the tensions between electronic literature and digital humanities. And this later on came out from Astrid, which is called the Pre-Web Digital Publishing and the Lore of Electronic Literature, where she traces the origins of electronic literature. Now, in the Indian context, we have these works. This work by Ritika Singh, as you may understand, is based on Terribly Tiny Tales, which, as you will see, will form the crux of the work that has been done in and around India. Shouvik Mukherjee, who's mostly known as a game studies person, wrote one of the fundamental critical pieces on electronic literature, No Country for Elit, where he is criticizing why electronic literature in 2017 was not yet a possibility in India. He talks about the infrastructural domains, and my work is an extension of Dr. Mukherjee's work in many cases. Well, there are, of course, interventions in the African space, in the Middle Eastern space, but for the paucity of time, I cannot go into that. But the work of Shanmuga Priya and Nirmala Menon is where we finally encounter electronic literature in different practices, and we come across certain ways of historicizing electronic literature. Now, in this paper, they try to locate practices and they try to connect electronic literature with old practices like the Gita Govinda, the Chitra Kavi, etc., and so on. And they talk and they borrow from the Genetian notion of the paratext, and they come up with something in the later paper called the techno icon that I will discuss in that the final paper, the techno icon of digital poetry. I will not go into all that because that can be a little bit too critical at this point. They talk about SMS novels in this later paper called First and Second Waves of Indian Electronic Literature. And as you may understand, this is a Halesian idea. This is an SMS novel that was converted into a blog. So the materiality, once again, the materiality, right? That it was shared via phone messaging. So that materiality is very important. And the second wave of electronic literature, once again, they go back to Terribly Tiny Tales and so on and so forth. And in Techno Icon, they talk about the poetics of electronic literature a lot. And I will show this paper a little bit, but I will not delve into it a lot because it is a bit more on the critical side of things, and I don't have access to it as of yet. And the accessible version is not with me currently. Now, this is the paper. This is what I will be talking about next. Praveen Sinha, I commissioned Praveen Sinha to write about leaning haiku, augmented reality technology, generative text, and body gestures. Now, what Praveen did was that he created an Instagram filter where he was basically moving his head and the filter was reading his bodily gestures and picking up on it and generating random lines. Now, you may have heard about the term large language model and chat GTP a lot, but these are not very new concepts. These have been there for a very long time. For this talk, I'll just be focusing on the building blocks. Now, this is my work that I come to finally, where I talk about the digital divide and what problems people may have if they are doing literature, electronic literature, alone and all by themselves. Here I also talk about how a certain sense of print aesthetic can percolate into the electronic because we are more familiar with the print than we are with the digital. Of course, not our generation, I'm talking about more generations as well. I will talk about the data in the next slide. But of course, here are certain variants of electronic literature that I will quickly show you. And these are a few practitioners that you can look into. Dina Larson, Richard Holliton, Lyle Skynes, Clara Fernandez Vera. All of them are big names in the field. And please, you can look into their work, and I believe that it would be very interesting. So very quickly, let's just go over some of the electronic literature texts and just look at how many types of electronic literature texts can there possibly be. Now, as you can see, that this is my blog, a very simple blog posts with posts dating back to 2015, 2016. And you open a post and you get to read the story, and if there are hyperlinks, very good. There are images, there are certain things in bold, uh, and there is a picture, and there are certain other, you see that these are the sponsored contents that can change. Now when you are reading something in the digital space, these elements become very important as well, right? And as you can see, that these are the metadatas by which I have organized this, I have entreat this. So this is one form. And then comes this project, Disappearing Daughters, which was a project made by the Seattle Times based on the young women who were killed or trafficked in Juarez, Mexico. As you may see, the opening page has a background with moving image. Then we have text. Then we have a full screen with a video, with an audio overlay, which unfortunately you can't hear as of yet, with a poem. Then you have text again. Then you have pictures. And then you have this mother talking about her daughter, a video. Then you have just one screen with just a picture and one blob of text running up and down. So you see how different forms of media are mixing and interacting with each other. Enter Sultana's Reality is an inspirational based text from Begum Rokeya Sultana's text called Sultana's Dream. And Afra Shafiq, the artist of this, uses images from the CSSC Kolkata archive to talk about women and leisure and how women were perceived. I strongly recommend you to check out all of these pieces. They are fantastic, they are brilliant, and electronic literature is more about doing than it is about someone telling you how to do. Now, this is the draft jam that happened, and as you can see that this is Praveen talking about his work, where he is talking about the AR filter. As you can see that he is moving his head, and here you can see that uh, blobs of texts are being generated over here. So I showed you some types. Now this is the study that I was talking about, right? That most people, why do they do electronic literature? Once again, I will start slideshow, and please grant me 5 more minutes. Is that why do they write on the web? That is because mostly it can be small. 35% say that it can be small. I took an interview of 89 people. The web is free. You can hyperlink stuff which you cannot in print. You can archive them easily, 5.9%, and you can just keep it informal, right? But also in terms of platform, it's global, it's cool. You can have different media. You have been denied to publish in print because it's the infrastructures of publishing in print are difficult. And the two overwhelming boundaries is that because publishing in the digital is convenient and you have an easier access to a sense of community. But things get more interesting when we talk about gender and electronic literature. The people who identified as male in my survey talk about 70% or 80% talk about just a community and a sense of feel good or self improvement and boredom. But people who identified as women, 20% of them talk about emancipation and how the digital space formed as a mean of escaping the normative patriarchal gaze. So that form of intentionality becomes very crucial, that it's not just what we are reading or where we are reading, but who are we reading and what it means to them for allowing us to read it, right? Now, of course, there are problems of the canon. How do you create a canon of electronic literature? There have been efforts to canonize electronic literature, of course. I'll show you a few examples. I cannot go over all of them because of the paucity of time, but I will show you. Of course, I have these resources. Uh, I cannot open the ELC for some reason. I don't know why. So I'll just show you a few. So the Electronic Literature Lab is there. Then this is the database that I was talking about at the start, the Electronic Literature Knowledge Base. As you can see, that this is a metadata organized database. It has creative works, critical writing, platforms and software, teaching resources, and everything you will find over here. And this is a full-blown archive of electronic literature, which is run by Dini Grigar. She's fantastic. And this has not just electronic texts, but this features restorations of electronic texts. You know, the texts which were done in Flash, which has become obsolete now. And it has those as well. Now, there are a lot of politics when we talk about these issues. That how do we do electronic literature? How do we archive electronic literature, so as to speak? These politics have been dealt with as well. And ELO features exhibitions, because electronic literature is not just about uh, doing scholarship, it's also about exhibiting them. And this, as you can see, was the 2021 Electronic Literature Conference exhibit. And I was very fortunate to be one of these curatorial peer reviewing members for this exhibit. And as you can see, that all of these are different exhibits. You know, this is the post-human, COVID, platforms, after Flash. This is the electronic literature for children. And this is the one that I will be showing because this has an Indian collaborator. So this exhibition of electronic literature is just an Excel sheet, which begs the question that can electronic literature, or is electronic literature, just hi-fi forms of textuality? Can it not be just a simple database in a simple Excel sheet? As you can see here, you have papers, games, all of them are organized in this manner. So you question infrastructures, you question the basis of them, right? And there is also the electronic literature collection that I couldn't show because the link wasn't opening up. So please just type in electronic literature collection, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, volume 4, and you will be able to see them, no problem. And finally, before I end, disciplinary intersections. Of course, it has similarity with digital humanities, critical infrastructure studies, video game studies, science and technology studies, and of course, narratology. I couldn't go into more details, but I wanted to sprinkle these crumbs around so that if you are interested, you can explore them on your own. And finally, thank you so much. This has been me. I will just display my socials and my contact information here just for a little bit, my Twitter handle, my email, my Instagram, and my Facebook, so that you can contact me if and when as required as a part of institutional or your personal capacity. So yeah, I hope I have kept to time. I have exceeded the time by 10 minutes or 5 minutes or so. I apologize for that. So yeah, I believe that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for that very informative introduction to e-literature in the context of digital humanities. And thank you also for running us through carefully curated selections of foundational works in the field, which we will surely explore. And we know that we've just touched the tip of the iceberg with this particular session, and we hope to continue the conversation with you. We would really like to extend our thanks as a department for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so much, sir.
You are most welcome, and please don't call me sir. I'm just a second year PhD student.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Roy. So we'll wind it up here and we will be in touch with you, of course. Anyone else wants? Fine. Thank you.